The bank's letter landed on Maeve Holloway's kitchen table, like a death sentence written in polite language. 90 days. That was all that stood between her and the end of everything her father had built. Every fence post, every acre, every stone of the ranch house he'd raised with his own bleeding hands. The year was 1879. The Wyoming summer was already trying to cook the world alive, and every man in Harlan Crossing was taking quiet bets on how fast a widow with no cattle, no money, and a field that hadn't produced a crop in 11 years would pack her things and disappear. What none of them knew, what Maeve herself didn't know yet, was that she was about to ask the strangest question anyone in that county had ever heard, and the answer was going to change everything. If you're watching this from your city tonight, drop it in the comments below. Let me see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit like before you leave. The foreclosure notice had been sitting on the corner of the table for 3 days before Maeve actually read it all the way through. She'd picked it up twice, put it back down both times. The first morning, she told herself she needed coffee first. The second evening, she'd gotten as far as the third paragraph before the words started blurring, and she'd folded it back along its crease and gone out to check on the mare. She'd stood in the barn for nearly an hour, listening to the horse breathe, her hand resting flat on the animal's neck, not thinking about anything in particular. It was the kind of thing her mother used to do when bad news arrived. Walk away from it until you're ready to walk toward it. On the third morning, she read every word. 90 days. That was the sum of it. 90 days to come up with $412 in outstanding debt, plus the current payment, plus the bank's administrative fee, which was a polite term Maeve had always thought, for we want more money just because we can ask for it. If she failed to produce the full amount by the 1st of October, the Harlan Valley Lending Association would move to seize the property under the terms of the original mortgage agreement, a document her father had signed 17 years ago with enormous optimism and slightly shaky handwriting. $412. She set the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the east field. The east field, 60 acres of flat Wyoming ground that hadn't produced a meaningful harvest since the spring of 1868, lay there in the early morning light, looking exactly like what everyone in Harlan Crossing had been calling it for over a decade. Dead ground, cursed ground, Old Holloway's folly, they called it, when they were being generous. When they weren't being generous, they called it proof that Thomas Holloway had been a dreamer who didn't know the difference between ambition and stupidity. Maeve had grown up hearing both versions. She'd never quite figured out which one to believe. She was 35 years old. Her husband, Daniel, had been dead for 4 years, a riding accident that still didn't make complete sense to her, because Daniel had been a careful man who rarely did anything without thinking it through twice. The ranch had been struggling before that. It had been struggling harder after. She'd sold the cattle 2 years ago when it became clear she couldn't afford to feed them through another winter, and she'd spent the time since then scraping by on what the working fields produced, which wasn't enough, and what she could earn taking in mending from the town's more prosperous wives, which also wasn't enough. None of it had ever quite been enough. She poured herself a second cup of coffee she didn't really want and thought about her options with the flat, deliberate calm of a person who has already done their panicking in private. She could sell. That was the obvious answer. The one that 4 or 5 people had already suggested to her in the careful tones adults use when they're trying to tell you something you don't want to hear. The ranch would fetch something, even in its current state. Maybe enough to start over somewhere else with a small stake. Elias Croft had made a standing offer for the past 2 years, $380 for the whole property, land and buildings, take it or leave it. She'd left it 3 times now, and each time Croft had smiled the way a man smiles when he knows you'll eventually come around. She wasn't going to come around. The thought settled in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed, solid and immovable and slightly uncomfortable. This was her father's land. His father's before that, in a different form, before they'd come west and staked this particular piece of Wyoming ground as the thing they were going to build something permanent on. Her family had buried people here. There was a small plot behind the old oak near the creek where her mother lay, and beside her, the marker for her infant brother who hadn't made it past his first winter, and on the far edge, the freshish mound of earth that held her father, dead these past 7 months from a chest sickness that had taken him faster than anyone expected. She was not going to hand this land to Elias Croft for $380 and spend the rest of her life wondering what her father would have said about it, which left her with the problem of $412. She found the notebook on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not a day she'd have expected to change things. She'd been going through her father's study, not for the first time, but more carefully this time, looking for anything she might have missed. Receipts, land surveys, old correspondence, anything that might give her some leverage or some piece of information she could use. The room still smelled like him, tobacco and lanolin and something dry and dusty that she associated with old paper. Most of what she found was exactly what she'd expected. Farming records going back 20 years, letters from suppliers, a handful of newspaper clippings about land improvement techniques that her father had apparently found interesting enough to cut out and save, a deed to some equipment that had rusted to uselessness in the south barn. The notebook was tucked into the back of the bottom desk drawer, underneath a folded survey map she'd already looked at twice. It was small, the kind of pocket-sized thing a man carries in his coat, and the cover was worn soft from handling. Her father's initials were stamped on the front, and inside the handwriting was dense and sometimes hard to follow, the way her father had always written when he was working through something in his head rather than trying to communicate with anyone else. She sat down on the study floor with the afternoon light coming through the window behind her and started reading. Most of it was technical, notes about soil composition, sketches of drainage patterns, references to other properties she didn't recognize and other men's methods. Her father had been a reader, a researcher. He'd believed, sometimes to a fault, that someone else had probably already solved whatever problem you were facing if you could only find the right book. And then, near the middle, a section written in a different hand. Older, more careful. Notes from someone else, a drainage man named Holt, she gathered from context, who had come out to survey the East Field sometime in the early 1860s. "The ground is not dead," the entry read, in Holt's careful script. "I have seen this before in the river country. What looks like barren hardpan is often soil that has been drowned from below. Water trapped beneath it with nowhere to go, turning the roots to rot before they find any depth. The field is not dying. It is drowning." Maeve read it twice. Then she read her father's notes in the margins around it. Frantic, close-written annotations full of questions and half-answers and arrows pointing to sketches of something she eventually recognized as a drainage system. "Underground," he'd written at one point. "Not visible. Partially collapsed." If we could locate the main junction, the entry broke off there. And the next pages returned to the ordinary records of ordinary years, as if Thomas Holloway had been interrupted in the middle of working out the most important thing he'd ever thought, and had never quite found his way back to it. She sat with the notebook in her lap for a long time. Through the window she could see the East Field, brown and flat and stubbornly silent in the afternoon heat. Not dead, she thought. Drowning, yep. Maeve walked into Callum's Feed and Supply the following Friday morning, which was the most reliably populated time of the week. Farmers came in for supplies, stayed for conversation, and the back corner by the seed shelves became a kind of informal town forum, where the week's news got sorted through and opinions got distributed freely. She waited until there was a lull in whatever discussion had been happening when she walked in. There were maybe 8 or 9 men in the store. Del Purvis and his brother-in-law, 2 of the Garfield brothers who farmed east of the creek, old Nate Simmons, who came in mainly for the company, and a few others she recognized without knowing well. She said, clearly enough that everyone could hear, "I'm looking to buy 20 horses nobody wants." The silence was the particular kind that forms when people aren't sure whether they've heard correctly. "Work horses," she added. "Old ones, injured ones people figure aren't worth keeping. I'll pay what they're worth, which I know isn't much, but I need 20 of them." The first person to laugh was Harlan Garfield. It wasn't a cruel laugh, exactly, more the laugh of a man who doesn't quite believe what he's hearing and can't think of a more articulate response. 20 horses, he repeated. "For what exactly?" "Field work." "The East Field?" This was Del Purvis, and his tone was a degree more careful than Harlan's. "Yes." Another silence. Then Nate Simmons, who had the weathered patience of a man who'd watched a lot of things go wrong over a long life, and had mostly stopped being surprised by any of it, said quietly, "That field's been dead since before your father's time, Maeve. I know what people say about it." "It's not just people saying things, I know, she said again. I'm still looking for 20 horses. She was already turning toward the door. Behind her, she heard Harlan say something under his breath that got a short laugh from the room, and she didn't turn around to find out what it was. She'd learned a long time ago that turning around to find out what people were saying was rarely as useful as it felt in the moment. She walked out into the heat and stood on the plank sidewalk for a moment, letting the sun hit her face. Fine, she thought. Let them laugh. So Gideon Pike was not easy to find. She'd gotten his name from the notebook. Her father had referenced him in a marginal note as Gideon Pike, Drains and Irrigation, formerly county. After some asking around, she traced him to a small property about 6 miles south of town, a modest spread that showed the careful maintenance of a man who still worked hard but had mostly stopped working for other people. He was 71 years old. She could see his age in the slow way he got up from the chair on his porch when she rode up, and in the deliberate care with which he navigated the 3 porch steps. But his eyes were sharp, and when she handed him her father's notebook and pointed to the relevant section, he read it without any impatience, then looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You found this in Thomas's things? Last week. He came to me, your father did, 12, maybe 13 years ago. We talked about this for a while. He turned a few more pages, looking at the sketches. He wasn't wrong about the drainage. I never thought he was wrong. I just thought the work was too big for one operation to take on alone. What kind of work? Gideon sat back down in his chair, which she took as an invitation to stay. She tied her horse and sat on the top porch step, and he told her. The East Field, as best he could reconstruct it from his own surveys and her father's notes, had once sat above a functioning natural drainage system. A network of underground channels that had carried excess groundwater away from the topsoil and allowed the land to breathe. Something, sometime in the late 1850s or early 1860s, had disrupted that system. His best guess was a combination of things. A bad flood year, some upstream diversion, possibly some subsidence in the channel walls. Whatever the cause, the drainage had collapsed, and the water that was supposed to move through the system had instead found its way down into the soil and stayed there, trapped beneath the surface, building pressure, drowning roots, turning what should have been productive topsoil into something closer to waterlogged clay. The water's still there, he said. Or the effects of it are. You can see it if you know what to look for. The way the soil crusts in summer, the way it doesn't hold plant roots, but it also doesn't dry out the way dead soil should. Can it be fixed? He was quiet for a moment. If you can find the main junction, the central point where all the drainage lines converge, and if that junction is intact enough to be rebuilt, then theoretically, yes. You clear the blockages, you restore the channels, you give the water somewhere to go, and the land starts breathing again. He paused. But finding the junction is the hard part. The whole system is underground. Most of the original channels have probably silted over or collapsed. You'd be digging more or less blind. That's why I need the horses, Maeve said. He looked at her steadily. Explain that to me. She told him what she'd been thinking about since she'd read the notebook. A thing she'd half remembered from something her father had said once, about how old working horses, animals that had spent years moving across different kinds of ground, developed a sensitivity to subsurface conditions that humans couldn't replicate. They could sense the difference between firm ground and compromised ground through the pressure in their hooves, the resistance in the soil, sometimes things no human diagnostic could identify. Old drovers had known this. Old draft horsemen had used it. Her father had mentioned it, she thought in passing. She'd been a child. She hadn't understood it then. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. That's not nothing, he finally said. That's actually... I've heard of that being done. Felt horse surveys, some people call it. Does it work? I don't know for certain, but I don't know that it doesn't. He looked out toward the road. Your father was trying to do something real with that land. He just ran out of time. I have 90 days, Maeve said. How much money? She told him what she had left after the most recent round of bill payments. It was not a number that invited optimism. Gideon received it with a stillness that might have been alarm or might just have been thought. Well, he said after a moment, I suppose I've done more with less. The horses came in ones and twos over the following week and a half. She put out word through Gideon, through a couple of the farmers she trusted not to immediately make it the subject of the Friday morning feed store forum, and through a livestock handler named Clara Briggs, who knew where every unwanted animal in the county could be found. By the second week of July, she had 17 horses in her south pasture, a collection that would not have impressed anyone looking for quality animals. There was a bay draft horse with a healed leg fracture that had left him with a permanent off-stride, 3 aging mares that their previous owners had kept past their working years out of sentiment and then sold when sentiment became too expensive, a pair of grays with bad teeth, a big roan gelding that had reportedly been difficult, which in Maeve's experience usually meant that the horse had a perspective on things that his handlers hadn't bothered to understand. Several more of similar vintage and history. They were not impressive animals, but watching them settle into the south pasture on the second evening, moving around each other with the careful social negotiation of animals getting acquainted, Maeve felt something she couldn't quite name. Not confidence exactly, but something in that neighborhood. The roan walked the fence line methodically, testing it. The bay draft stood in the middle of the field with his head low and his eyes half closed, reading something she couldn't read. She needed 3 more horses to reach her number. She wasn't sure why 20 had struck her as the right figure, something from the notebook maybe, or something from the back of her own instincts. But she was committed to it now. Clara Briggs came back with 2 more animals the following week, a sorrel mare with a partial blindness in one eye, and a small, compact brown horse of indeterminate age who had been used as a pony cart animal and then abandoned when his owner moved east. And the 20th horse came from a place she hadn't expected. Del Purvis showed up on a Wednesday afternoon with an old black horse in tow, a former plow animal that he said had been standing in his far pasture for 2 years, eating grass and not doing much else. "He's too old for real work," Del said, handing over the lead rope with an expression that was somewhere between reluctant and embarrassed. "But if you're doing what I think you're doing—" He stopped, started again. "My grandfather used to say that old horses remember ground that young ones haven't learned yet." Maeve looked at him. "I'm not saying I think it'll work," Del said quickly. "I'm just saying, this horse has been on every piece of ground in this county for 20 years. If any animal knows what's under that field, it'd be him." "Thank you, Del." He nodded once, sharply, and turned back toward his wagon. "Don't thank me. Just don't tell Harlan Garfield I gave you a horse. I'll never hear the end of it." On the 18th of July, Maeve took the horses into the east field for the first time. She and Gideon had spent 2 evenings working out a rough grid pattern, a way of moving the animals across the field in overlapping passes that would, theoretically, allow them to cover the whole 60 acres systematically. Gideon rode one of the horses himself, an activity that seemed to cost him some physical discomfort that he bore without complaint. Maeve rode the roan, who turned out to be not difficult at all, but simply sensitive. He responded to the lightest pressure and had an attention to his surroundings that she found almost eerie in its thoroughness. The theory was simple, in the way that things sound simple before you try them. Horses with ground sensitivity would behave differently, slower, more careful, sometimes reluctant to continue, when they crossed ground that was structurally compromised by subsurface water pressure. You watched them. You noted where they hesitated. You marked those spots and compared them to see if any pattern emerged. In practice, the first 3 hours were inconclusive and exhausting and very, very hot. The horses moved across the field in the patterns she and Gideon had worked out, and most of them behaved more or less as they would in any field, and the July sun was direct and unforgiving, and by midday Maeve was beginning to wonder, not for the first time and more sharply than before, whether she had made a catastrophic mistake. Then the roan stopped. He didn't stop dramatically. He simply ceased forward motion at a point about 40 yards in from the field's northwest corner, and when she pressed him gently, he shifted sideways rather than continuing forward, the way a horse does when it finds a footing it doesn't trust. She let him stand. She looked at the ground under his hooves, unremarkable, dry-crusted, the same featureless brown clay as everything around it. Then she looked to her right, where the old black horse Del had brought her was moving in his pattern, and watched him slow, then veer, then stop at a point maybe 60 feet from where she was sitting. Same line of hesitation, different horses, same approximate latitude across the field. She pulled out the grid map she'd been marking and put down a dot at both locations. "Gideon," she called. He was already watching her from the far side of the field. He'd seen it too. They worked for another 4 hours that afternoon, and by the end of it they had 11 marked points on the grid. Not evenly distributed, but forming something that, when Maeve looked at the map with her eyes slightly unfocused, suggested the rough path of something running beneath the ground. Something that curved south toward the creek, then bent back northeast in a direction that led toward the property's far boundary. A channel. Possibly. Maybe. That night, she spread the grid on the kitchen table and looked at it until her eyes ached. The land remembered, her father had written in the notebook. She put her finger on the point where the two horses had stopped and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she might actually know what she was doing. B. The town found out, of course. News in a small frontier community moves through the air like weather. You never quite see it travel, but it gets everywhere anyway. By the end of the week, most of Harlan Crossing knew that Maeve Holloway was out in her dead field, riding a bunch of worthless horses in patterns and marking things on a map, and the response was largely predictable. She heard about it secondhand, mostly through Claire Briggs, who seemed to find the whole situation entertaining in a detached sort of way. Harlan Garfield had apparently made a comment about it at the feed store that had gotten considerable mileage. The banker, a man named Aldous Fenn, had been overheard expressing quiet sympathy for the Holloway woman in a tone that suggested he was already mentally composing the foreclosure paperwork. One of the pastor's wives had made a remark about the importance of accepting what could not be changed, which was the kind of thing people said when they had already decided you were going to fail and wanted to feel compassionate about it. None of it surprised her. What surprised her was Rachel Voss. Rachel Voss was 60 years old, a widow like Maeve, owner of the general store, and generally regarded as one of the sharper practical minds in the county. A woman who had kept her business running for 30 years on a combination of genuine commercial instinct and a flat refusal to extend credit to anyone she didn't trust. She was not warm, exactly, but she was fair, and people respected her even when they found her difficult. She came out to the field on a Thursday morning without being invited, stood at the fence line watching for a while, and then walked to where Maeve was checking one of the marked grid points. "That the field map?" she asked, nodding at the papers in Maeve's hand. "Yes." "May I?" Maeve handed it to her. Rachel looked at it carefully, in the way she looked at invoices, checking the numbers, checking the logic, not volunteering an opinion until she'd seen the whole thing. "This pattern here," she said, tracing the curve of marked points with one finger. "That follow the old stream bed?" "I think so. I think the drainage system was built to follow it." "Your father thought this?" "My father got most of the way to thinking this. He didn't quite get to the end." Rachel handed the map back. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the field with the flat, assessing gaze she applied to inventory. "What do you need?" "Right now. More time and less heat." "What do you actually need?" Not the flip answer. Maeve looked at her. "I need to find the main junction, the central point where all the channels converge. If I can find that and it's intact enough to work with, I think we can rebuild the system. But I'm running out of time before I run out of answers, and I don't know yet where the junction is." Rachel nodded once. "The old Hartley survey, 1857 or 58, I think, before they built the road." She must have seen the question in Maeve's face because she added, "My husband kept every county survey that ever came through. I always thought it was clutter. He thought it was history." A pause. "Might have something about pre-development water patterns. It's in the back of the store if you want to look at it." Maeve looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Rachel's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it slightly. Not softening, exactly, but adjusting. "Because your father was a serious man who made a serious bet, and serious bets deserve more than laughter." She turned and walked back toward the fence line without waiting for a response. "Come by before closing." The Hartley survey was a revelation. It was old, the paper fragile at the creases, the ink faded to a pale rust color in some sections. But the draftsmanship was careful and detailed, and once Maeve's eyes adjusted to the notation style of a surveyor working 20 years earlier, she began to see things. The pre-development land survey showed the East Field as it had been before extensive settlement, and what it showed was a network of natural drainage channels, some of them marked, some of them indicated by the topographic lines alone. Gideon sat with her over the survey for 2 hours the following evening, cross-referencing it with her father's notebook and the grid map they'd built from the horses' behavior. The pieces aligned, not perfectly. Nothing ever aligned perfectly, but enough to see the shape of the thing. Here, Gideon said, putting his finger on a point near the survey's eastern section. This is where all the lines converge. This is the junction. On the grid map, corresponding to that same point, there were 5 separate horse hesitations. 5 different animals on 5 different passes, all registering some kind of anomaly at or near the same location. Maeve looked at the 2 maps laid side by side for a long time. That's the center of the field, she said. That's where we start digging. The first shovel went into the ground on the 22nd of July. It was Maeve and Gideon and nobody else, in the early morning before the heat got fully established. The ground resisted. The crust was hard, the clay beneath it dense and stubborn, exactly what she'd been told to expect. After 4 hours, they had a trench 6 feet long and 2 feet deep, and she was grateful for the years of ranch work that had kept her arms and back in something resembling condition, because this was hard in the way that only sustained physical labor can be hard. By the afternoon, the trench was 4 feet deep. By the following morning, Gideon's shovel hit something that rang different. He stopped, looked at her. She was beside him in the trench before the echo had finished. 3 more careful inches of digging revealed the edge of something. Stone-lined, deliberate, old. The upper edge of a drainage channel, built by hands that neither of them had ever known. In a decade neither of them could clearly remember. It was real. It was there. The field was not dead. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The stone edge Gideon's shovel had found was not a clean discovery. It didn't reveal itself all at once the way things do in stories where the universe cooperates with the person doing the work. It came in pieces, a corner here, a flat-laid section there, and then a stretch that crumbled when they tried to clear the mud away from it, dropping a foot of carefully laid stone back into the channel it had once contained. Gideon swore quietly under his breath, which Maeve had already learned was his equivalent of a loud response. She crouched at the edge of the trench and looked at the damage. "How bad?" she asked. "That section's gone," he said, "but the walls on either side look solid. That's something." He pressed his palm against the intact stone. "This is good work. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Can we work around the collapsed part?" "We're going to have to." They spent the rest of that day and all of the next clearing the trench without disturbing the channel walls further, which meant working in a way that was slow and careful and deeply unglamorous. Small shovelfuls, hands pulling mud away from the stonework, Gideon lying flat at the bottom of the trench at one point to get a better look at the channel's underside. He was not a young man doing this. Maeve watched him straighten up afterward with the careful movements of someone whose back had an opinion about the whole enterprise, and she didn't say anything about it because she knew he wouldn't want her to. What they found, once they had cleared the junction's main section, was both better and worse than she'd been hoping for. The central structure was largely intact, the stone-lined chamber where the drainage lines converged, built with an engineering competence that neither of them had quite expected from what amounted to a pre-settlement agricultural project. The main channel running south toward the creek was clear, at least for the first several feet they could reach. But there were 3 secondary channels feeding into the junction from different directions, and of those 3, one was completely silted over. One had partially collapsed about 8 feet in, and the third was open but running in the wrong direction. Something had shifted in the surrounding soil over the decades and redirected its angle, which meant water coming through it would pool at the junction rather than drain away from it. Gideon sat on the edge of the trench in the late afternoon heat and studied the sketch he'd been making of the system. His hat was pushed back on his head. There was mud on his forearms. "This is more than a day's work," he said. It was not a complaint. It was an assessment. "I know. The silted channel. We can clear that. Time-consuming but straightforward." He tapped the sketch. "The collapsed section. Same thing, mostly. But this redirected one..." He shook his head slightly. "We need to understand why it shifted before we try to correct it. Otherwise, we fix it and it shifts again." "How long to understand why?" "Couple days of observation, maybe. Look at the surrounding soil, figure out what moved and why." He looked up at her. "We're about 30 days into your 90. She knew. She'd been keeping track on a piece of paper tacked to the kitchen wall with a nail, and every morning when she went to make coffee, she looked at it, and every morning the number was smaller. "Then we start on the silted channel tomorrow," she said, "and we observe the third one while we work. Gideon nodded. He didn't tell her they were going to be fine. She appreciated that. Gideon was not a man who said things weren't true. The gossip had shifted sometime in the last week, she realized. It hadn't stopped. Gossip in a town like Harlan Crossing didn't stop, it just changed form. But where the original version had been mostly dismissive, the current version had acquired a note of something else. Not respect, exactly. More like the watchful attention people give to something they've already written off but aren't quite ready to stop watching. She noticed it at the post office, where the woman behind the counter gave her a look that was more curious than dismissive. She noticed it when Harlan Garfield rode past the field one morning, slowed his horse, and watched for several minutes before continuing on his way without saying anything. She noticed it most clearly when Clara Briggs stopped by with a message about a horse she'd found, and then stayed for 20 minutes asking questions about the drainage system that went considerably beyond what politeness required. "People are talking," Clara said at the end of it. "I know people are talking. I mean differently than before." Clara looked at the trench where Gideon was working. Before it was funny. Now it's... She searched for the word. Unsettling, maybe. Like when you're sure a thing's going to happen one way and it starts happening another way, and you don't know what to do with that yet. "I haven't done anything yet," Maeve said. "I've dug a hole." "You've dug a hole where 4 generations of people said there was nothing worth digging for." Clara paused. "That's more than nothing." After Clara left, Maeve went back to the trench and picked up her shovel and thought about that for a while. She didn't find it particularly comforting. What she found was that the work was the same whether people were watching or not, and the numbers on her kitchen wall were the same, and the channel needed to be cleared, and it wasn't going to clear itself. She drove her shovel into the silted earth and got back to it. Clearing the silted channel took 4 days. 4 days of bent-back work in a trench that grew by measured increments, pulling out compacted mud and silt and the debris of decades, leaves and root matter and small stones, and once, inexplicably, what appeared to be part of a leather harness, stiff as wood and dark with age. Gideon identified one section where tree roots had forced themselves down into the channel and had to be cut away carefully to avoid destabilizing the walls. The heat was consistent and merciless. By the end of each day, they were both coated in a layer of mud and dried sweat that clothing could only partially contain. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. She'd been working in the trench since early morning, and it was past midday when she heard horses approaching across the field. She straightened up, hand on her back, and looked. It was Del Purvis, and behind him, 2 men she recognized from around the county. Brothers named Tolliver, who farmed a spread about 4 miles west. They had a wagon, and in it were shovels and a section of wooden planking and a jug of water. Del pulled up at the edge of the trench. He looked down at Gideon, who had paused his work and was looking up with an expression of neutral curiosity. "My brother-in-law and I had an afternoon," Del said to Maeve, in a tone that suggested he'd rehearsed this and still found it slightly uncomfortable. "The Tollivers had an afternoon too, it turns out. We thought we'd come see if there was anything useful we could do." Maeve looked at him, then at the Tollivers. "You came to help dig?" "We came to see what you were doing," the older Tolliver brother said honestly. "But we brought shovels, so if it turns out you need help digging, that works too." She looked at Del again. "Don't read anything into it," he said. "I owe your father a favor from 14 years ago, and I never paid it back." This seemed like a reasonable time. There was a beat of silence. "There's a secondary channel that needs clearing starting about 40 feet east of where we're working," Gideon said from the bottom of the trench, not looking up. "Somebody willing to start on that would save us 2 days. Del climbed down from his horse. That was how it started. Not with a speech, not with any formal arrangement, just Del Purvis climbing down from his horse with a shovel because he owed a dead man a favor, and the Tolliver brothers following because they'd come this far and had nothing else to do with their afternoon. By the end of that day, they'd cleared the secondary channel to within 2 feet of where it connected with the main line. They stayed until the light went, which was longer than Maeve had expected, and they didn't talk much while they worked. The Tollivers went home. Del unhitched the wagon horse to let it graze and sat on the wagon bed for a while eating something he'd brought wrapped in cloth. And when Maeve came over to check a measurement, he said, without looking up from his food, "The Garfield brothers might come by tomorrow." "Did you tell them to?" "I told Harlan what we found today. The channel structure, what it means. He chewed. He didn't say much, but he didn't laugh either. That's something, coming from Harlan. Harlan Garfield did not come the next day. He came the day after that, alone, in the late afternoon, and he didn't bring a shovel. He stood at the edge of the cleared junction area and looked at it for a long time with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low against the sun. Maeve let him look. She was too tired for conversation she didn't need to have. That's real stonework, he said finally. Yes. That's old. Best we can figure, it was built sometime in the late 1840s. Before the Holloways, probably, whoever first broke this ground. He was quiet. He turned his head to look at where Gideon was working on the third channel, the redirected one, which they'd started on 2 days ago after Gideon had determined that the shifting was caused by a clay layer that had softened and settled after a series of wet years in the early 1870s. It was the most technically complicated of the three branches, and Gideon had been working on it with the focused, slightly irritable concentration of a man solving a problem that was taking longer than he thought it should. He really thinks this'll work? Harlan asked. He was looking at Gideon, but not addressing him. He thinks the system is sound enough that if we can get the channels clear and correctly oriented, the water will move the way it's supposed to move. And then what? The field just gets better? Not instantly, but the soil will start draining properly. The waterlogging that's been killing root growth will clear over 1 or 2 seasons. The topsoil should recover. She paused. That's the theory. Theories, Harlan said, in a tone that was half dismissal and half something more complicated. He looked at the field, at the horses, who were standing in their usual loose group near the south end, at the trenches, the piles of displaced soil, the careful markers she'd been using to track each excavation point. Your father was serious about this land, he said. Yes. Most people thought he was just stubborn. Most people think stubborn and serious are the same thing. Harlan made a sound that might have been a short laugh. He unfolded his arms. My brother's coming tomorrow. He's good with stonework, if you need somebody who knows how to rebuild a channel lining properly. He said it quickly, like something that cost him something to say. Up to you whether you use him. He turned and walked back to his horse before she could respond, which she thought was probably intentional. She watched him ride out of the field. Did Harlan Garfield just offer to help? Gideon asked from the trench. Something like that. Lord, he went back to his work. Must be further along than I thought. Except, the redirected channel was the problem that kept being a problem. Every time she thought they had a handle on it, something else emerged. The clay layer Gideon had identified as the cause of the shifting turned out to be thicker than anticipated, which meant the correction wasn't simply a matter of reorienting the channel. They had to account for the fact that the same conditions that had caused the first shift could cause another one if they didn't address the underlying instability. Gideon's solution was to pack the channel's base with gravel before rebuilding the stone lining, creating a foundation that would resist future clay movement. It was the right solution. It was also time-consuming and required materials they hadn't originally planned to buy. She did the math one evening at the kitchen table with the lantern turned up and the numbers spread out in front of her. Between what she had on hand, what she'd already spent, and what Gideon's revised estimate for the channel repair would cost, she was looking at approximately $6 more than she had available. $6 wasn't nothing. $6 at the moment was a very specific problem. She sat with it for a while. Then she went and looked at the paper on the wall with the number on it. 51 days gone. 39 left. She thought about the gravel, about the channel, about what happened if the third branch wasn't properly repaired. All the work they'd done on the other 2 channels would be compromised, because the junction needed all 3 lines functioning to move water effectively. Fix 2 and leave 1 broken, and you had a system that looked repaired but wasn't. She put the lantern out and went to bed and didn't sleep particularly well. In the morning, she got up, made coffee, and rode to Rachel Voss's store. She wasn't going to ask for money. She'd decided that before she'd gotten on the horse. What she was going to do was ask whether Rachel knew of any work she could pick up in the next week. Something she could do in the evenings or early mornings before the field work started. Mending, hauling, cleaning, she didn't care what it was. Rachel listened to all of this without interrupting, leaning against the store counter with her arms folded. When Maeve finished, Rachel said, "How much do you need?" I told you I'm not offering charity, Rachel said, in a tone that closed that particular door firmly. I'm asking how much you need for the gravel, because if it's under $10, I have a business proposition. Maeve looked at her. What kind of proposition? The kind where you owe me a debt payable in corn at harvest rates, assuming there is a harvest. Rachel's expression was the same flat, practical look she gave to everything. If there isn't a harvest, you owe me nothing, because if your field doesn't produce, neither of us is in a position to quibble over $6. That's not much of a business proposition for you. It's a reasonable bet. I've been watching that field for 30 years, and I've been watching you for the past 6 weeks, and my assessment is that you have a better chance of succeeding than most people think. She paused. I've made worse bets. Maeve turned her hat in her hands. She didn't like being in debt to anyone. She liked the conditional shape of this debt slightly better than she liked most alternatives. $6, she said. Maybe 6.5. Rachel went to the back of the store and came back with $7 in coin and set it on the counter without ceremony. Corn at harvest rates, she said. Assuming harvest. And if you can get more than 60 acres producing next season, I have customers who'd pay fair price for a regular supply. Maeve pocketed the coins. You're already planning for next year. I'm a merchant. I plan for everything. Rachel picked up the ledger she'd set aside when Maeve came in. Now go fix your channel. Okay. On a Thursday morning at the beginning of August, they connected all 3 cleaned branches to the repaired junction. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no ceremony to it. Gideon cleared the last section of blockage in the 3rd channel, and they both stood there in the trench looking at the point where 3 stone-lined passages came together in the central chamber. And then Gideon said, "That should be it," and climbed out. They watched. The first sign was subtle, almost so subtle Maeve wasn't sure she was seeing it. A slight darkening of the soil in the trench bottom near the junction. A very slow movement of something she couldn't quite name. Then a thin line of dark water appeared at the base of the main channel. Not flowing exactly, more seeping, finding its way through compacted soil with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time. Gideon made a low sound in his throat. "It's moving," she said. "It's moving." She stood there watching the thin dark water make its slow way through the stone channel, and she felt something that she couldn't have put clean words to. Not triumph, because they weren't at triumph yet, and she knew it, and not relief, because there was still too much uncertainty for relief. Something in between. The feeling of having been right about something that everyone around her had been certain she was wrong about. She looked across the field. The horses were standing at the south end the way they often did in the afternoon, the roan slightly apart from the others. Head up, ears forward, reading something in the air or the ground that she couldn't read. She thought of her father lying on his back in the study during a bad winter, his chest rattling with every breath, telling her, "The East Field isn't finished, Maeve. It's just waiting." She'd thought it was fever talking. She'd sat with him and held his hand and nodded, and privately she'd thought, maybe it's time to let the East Field be finished. She owed him an apology. She owed the land an apology too, maybe. 60 acres of Wyoming ground that had been called dead and cursed and useless for over a decade, all because nobody had been willing to look at what was actually wrong with it. The water moved through the channel, slow and purposeful, and absolutely indifferent to how long it had been made to wait. Gideon sat down heavily on the pile of displaced soil beside the trench and rubbed the side of his face with one muddy hand. He looked tired in the way that wasn't just physical. The tiredness of a man who has worked very hard at something that mattered and doesn't quite know how to shift into a different gear. "What do we do now?" she asked him. "Now?" He looked in the channel. "Now we wait a few days and see how the drainage propagates through the field. Then we make sure the main channel to the creek is clear all the way through." He paused. "Then we think about planting. We have maybe 30 days before frost risk. It's tight," he said. "Is tight possible?" He thought about it honestly. Corn is tight. Corn needs longer. But there's a variety. Shorter season, early maturity. Not as high a yield, but it produces in the time you've got. She had not known this. She filed it immediately alongside everything else she'd learned in the past 6 weeks that she hadn't known when she started. "Where do I get it?" "Rachel Voss will know," he said, without any particular emphasis, which was simply a fact about Rachel Voss and what she knew. Maeve looked at the channel one more time. The water was moving a little more freely now. Still slow, still finding its way, but unmistakably moving. The soil around the junction was darker than it had been an hour ago, the trapped underground pressure beginning, at last, to find a direction to go. 30 days, give or take. 30 days to get the field planted and see whether 60 acres of drowned earth could remember how to be land again. She picked up her shovel. There was still the main channel to walk and check, a quarter-mile of stonework running toward the creek that might be clear or might have its own surprises waiting. She was going to find out. The main channel to the creek was not clear. She found the first blockage about 130 feet south of the junction, a section where the channel walls had partially collapsed inward, packing the passage with a mixture of stone rubble and compacted silt that would have taken 2 people a full day to clear. She marked it and kept walking, following the line of the channel as best she could read it from the surface, watching for the subtle ground-level signs Gideon had taught her to notice. The slight depression in the soil, the different texture of the crust, the way certain grasses grew in thin lines that followed underground water patterns. She found 3 more blockages before she reached the creek. She stood at the bank for a while, looking at the water moving past, and did a calculation in her head that she didn't particularly enjoy doing. 4 blockages in the main channel, in addition to the work they'd already finished at the junction. The shorter season corn seed that she hadn't bought yet and didn't know the price of. The frost window that was not getting wider. The paper on her kitchen wall. 28 days, she thought. Maybe 29. She walked back to the junction and told Gideon. He listened without interrupting, then looked at his sketch of the system and said nothing for long enough that she started to wonder if she should say something else. 4 blockages, he said finally. The first one's the worst. The others looked manageable. What kind of manageable? Half a day each, maybe less on the third one. He folded the sketch and put it in his coat pocket. We need more hands. Not helpful hands that come and go. People who'll commit to seeing this through to the planting. Del Purvis came back 3 times. Del Purvis is one man with his own farm to run. Gideon looked at her directly. You need to ask people, Maeve, not wait for them to show up. She didn't respond immediately. Asking had never come easily to her. Not asking for help, not asking for anything that put her in the position of needing something from someone else. She'd watched her father navigate that same resistance his whole life, the particular stubbornness of a person who'd been told too many times that what they needed wasn't available until they stopped asking and started doing everything themselves instead. If I ask, and they say no, then they say no, and you're no worse off than you are right now. Gideon's voice wasn't unkind, but it had the firmness of a man who had watched too many people fail because of pride to be patient about it. But I don't think they'll say no. I think the situation has changed more than you've been paying attention to. She paid attention to plenty of things. She thought she'd been watching the town carefully enough, but Gideon had decades on her, and he'd been watching people work and not work his whole professional life. She asked. She started with Del, which was easiest, and then the Tolliver brothers. And then she found herself at the Garfield farm on a Tuesday morning talking to both brothers together, which was harder because Harlan Garfield had an audience and had not quite committed to anything yet, and she wasn't sure how the conversation was going to go. She laid it out plainly. Where they were, what was left to do, what the timeline looked like. She brought the sketch Gideon had made of the channel system and spread it on the Garfield's kitchen table and let them look at it while she talked. Harlan's brother, whose name was Cass, had a different quality of attention than Harlan. Quieter, more focused. The kind of man who listened before he talked. He was the one who'd been helping with the stonework. He crouched over the sketch and put his finger on the first blockage location. This one's the deepest? He asked. Best I can tell. The wall collapse brought a lot of material down. We'll need to shore the sides before we can really get at the center. Otherwise we pull material out and the walls drop more. He looked up. You have planking. Del has some from last time, and there's more in the south barn. All right. He stood up. He didn't look at Harlan. He said to Maeve, We'll come Thursday. Harlan, who had been standing with his arms crossed, and his face doing the complicated work of a man deciding how much of his earlier skepticism he was willing to quietly abandon, said, I'll come too. 2 extra bodies is better than 1, but... It was as close to an apology as Harlan Garfield was probably going to get to anyone for anything. Maeve accepted it for what it was, By Wednesday evening, she had commitments from 11 people. Not all of them could come every day. Not all of them had the same level of skill or the same physical capacity for the work. But 11 people, in addition to her and Gideon, was a work party large enough to run 2 operations simultaneously, which meant clearing the main channel while also beginning the preparation of the field surface for planting. She sat on the porch that night and thought about the fact that 6 weeks ago she had walked out of Callum's feed and supply while 8 men laughed at her. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt more complicated than that, like a debt of some kind, owed in multiple directions that she couldn't quite calculate yet. Thursday started with the kind of morning that Wyoming sometimes produced in early August, clear and bright and cool enough to make you forget the heat was coming. The sky a hard, clean blue that looked almost close enough to touch. Maeve had been up since before light, going over the plan for the day. And when the first wagon started arriving at 7, she was ready, which was good because there was not a lot of time for organizing people who'd already decided to do a thing. Cass Garfield took charge of the main channel crew without anyone specifically asking him to, which was the right outcome because he was the best at the technical side of the work. He walked the first blockage location with Dell and one of the Tollivers, assessed the wall situation, and had them placing the first shore timbers before 8 o'clock. Maeve watched the efficiency of it for a moment, the way a group of people who actually knew what they were doing organized themselves, and then turned her attention to the field preparation crew. Gideon was directing 3 other men in turning the surface of the east field, using a combination of draft horses and manual work to break up the baked crust that had formed over the waterlogged clay. The drainage had been running for 4 days now, and the effects were beginning to show. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have satisfied someone looking for a miracle, but in small material ways. The crust was cracking in places it hadn't cracked before. The color of the soil in the lower sections of the field was different, darker, suggesting that moisture was moving through it rather than simply sitting stagnant below. Gideon had pressed a stick into the ground at a test point the day before and pulled it out to show Maeve the soil clinging to it. Real soil, with texture and density, not the gray clay paste that the field had been producing when she'd first tested it after reading her father's notebook. "It's responding," he'd said. Plain as that. It's responding. She'd allowed herself exactly 15 seconds to feel something about that before turning back to the work. Now the field crew was moving in a rough line from north to south, turning earth and checking drainage at intervals, and Maeve was everywhere at once. The channel operation, the field prep, the horses, the timber situation, the water supply for the work crews, the calculation in the back of her head that was always running. Time, money, days remaining. It was somewhere around mid-morning when the trouble started. The second blockage location was easier than the first had looked, which was a genuine relief, and the crew on the main channel made good progress through the morning. But around 11 o'clock, Cass came looking for Maeve at the field. His expression was not alarming exactly, but it had the specific quality of someone who needed to tell her something she wasn't going to enjoy. "What?" she said. "The third blockage, the one you said was manageable." He paused. "It's not straightforward." She walked with him to the location, about 240 feet south of the junction, where 2 of the other men had been working since early morning. The trench they'd opened showed why Cass had come to find her. What she'd assessed from the surface as a manageable blockage was, underneath, a section where the channel wall had not merely collapsed inward, but had been pushed inward, forced by the pressure of a root system that had grown through the stone over the course of decades and cracked the lining in a spreading pattern that extended further than any of them had seen from above. The roots had belonged to a cottonwood tree that no longer existed. She could see the old stump remnants in the soil above the channel. But the root system was still there, still occupying space, still exerting pressure on what remained of the stone lining. To clear the blockage properly, they had to remove the roots without causing the already compromised wall sections to fail entirely. "How long?" she asked Cass. 2 days if nothing else goes wrong. He said it honestly. 1 if we get lucky. 2 days. She ran the numbers. "We have enough planking to shore it?" "Barely. We might need to cannibalize some from the first site, but that one's done now, so do it." She looked at the root mass in the trench. "Whatever you need." He nodded and turned back to the work. She stood there for another moment, looking at the problem that had been hiding beneath a problem she'd thought she understood, and thought, this is how this goes. You clear one thing and find two more behind it. You solve the visible problem, and the invisible one introduces itself. She'd been doing this for 6 weeks, and she still caught herself being surprised by it. She went back to the field and picked up a shovel. The hot part of the day arrived around 1 in the afternoon and settled in with the comfortable permanence of something that planned to stay. The work slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. The way sustained physical labor slows when the temperature is working against you. People took water breaks more frequently. Conversation dropped off. What remained was the particular silence of people choosing to keep going anyway. Maeve was carrying timber to the third blockage site when she heard raised voices from the direction of the field. She changed direction. When she got to the source of the noise, she found 2 of the field crewmen standing at the edge of a section of the field she hadn't gotten to yet, a lower section near the field's center that had been one of the last areas she'd marked on the horse survey. One of them, a farmer named Bud, who'd shown up Tuesday without being asked and without explaining why, was crouching with his hand pressed into the soil. The other was looking at him with the expression of someone who's just been told something unpleasant. "What's wrong?" Maeve asked. Bud looked up. He was a weathered man in his 50s, not given to excessive speech, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him over the past few days. "This section's still wet," he said. "Not just damp, saturated." She crouched beside him and pressed her palm to the soil. He was right. The surface was dry enough, but the ground gave slightly under pressure in a way that the other sections of the field weren't doing. A faint yielding that meant the waterlogging was still present below. "How large a section?" she asked. He stood and walked in a rough circle, pressing his boot into the soil at intervals. About a third of the way around, he stopped. "Hard to say exactly. Maybe 8 acres, maybe 10. Right in the center here. 8 to 10 acres in the center of the field that weren't draining the way the rest of the field was draining." She already knew why before she made herself think it through. There was another branch, another drainage line feeding this section that wasn't connected to the main system they'd repaired. Either it had never been part of the original network, or it was a secondary line that had been missed entirely. She looked at the field, then at the horses. The roan was standing about 30 feet away, watching her with the alert, slightly skeptical expression he wore when something was happening that he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. She'd learned to pay attention to where the roan positioned himself. He had a habit of standing near things that mattered, in a way that had stopped seeming like coincidence about 3 weeks ago. He was standing at the edge of the saturated section. "Get Gideon," she said. "Sir." Gideon came, looked, pressed his own hand into the soil, then stood quietly for longer than she had patience for, but knew better than to interrupt. "Secondary branch," he said finally. "Has to be. This section is too isolated for it to be residual from the main lines." He turned slowly, reading the surface of the ground. "It runs there, probably northeast toward the property boundary." He looked at her. "We didn't find it because the horse surveys didn't cover this section as thoroughly. Can we connect it to the main junction?" "Probably, but it's more work. Another trench, another clearance job, another connection point." He took off his hat and looked at the sky briefly, not with any particular feeling, just as a man who has reached a certain point in a long task sometimes looks at the sky. "And we're going to run into it right where the corn needs to go." She looked at the central section of the field, the section where she'd been planning the densest planting, because the soil there had seemed, based on the horse surveys, to be the most recovered. And beneath it, another drainage problem that had been waiting quietly for someone to get close enough to find it. "If we plant without fixing it, what happens?" "Root rot," Gideon said. "Same thing that's been happening for 11 years. The corn will germinate fine, might even look healthy for a few weeks. Then the roots hit the waterlogged layer and—" He made a slight gesture with one hand that didn't need finishing. "And if we try to fix it in the time we have left—" "It's tight," he said. The same word he'd used 3 weeks ago about the planting window. "We have to open a new trench, locate the blockage, clear it, build the connection. And we haven't found the blockage yet." A pause. "And we have 24 days, she said. He put his hat back on. "We have 24 days. She stood in the middle of the field with the heat pressing down and the sound of the main channel crew working in the distance, and the roan watching her from 30 feet away with his calm, alien patience. And she made the calculation she'd been trying to avoid making. The materials for the secondary branch would cost money she'd been keeping in reserve for winter. Not all of it, but enough that spending it now would leave her very thin margin for the cold months, even assuming a good harvest. The alternative was planting over the saturated section and risking losing that portion of the crop, which would reduce the harvest yield and might not produce enough to pay the bank debt in full. There was no version of this where all the numbers were comfortable. "What's the first step?" she asked. "Horse survey of that northeast line. Today, before we lose the afternoon light." She put her fingers in her mouth and whistled, which was not a ladylike thing to do, and she had never particularly cared. The roan's ears went forward. "Let's find out where it goes," she said. The secondary branch survey took the rest of the afternoon. She and Gideon ran the roan in the old black horse Dell had brought across the northeast section in overlapping passes, watching, marking, building the picture one hesitation at a time. It was the same process she'd run 6 weeks ago across the whole field, and she moved through it now with a different fluency than she'd had then. She knew what she was looking for, knew how to read the horse's body language, knew the difference between a hesitation that meant something and one that was just an animal being an animal. By the time the sun was getting low, they had 17 marked points forming a rough line that ran northeast from the saturated section toward the property's far corner, curving slightly as it went in a way that suggested a natural feature. A long-ago streambed, maybe, or a slope in the bedrock beneath. Gideon looked at the completed map as she held it in the fading light. "The blockage is probably here," he said, tapping a cluster of 3 closely spaced marks about halfway along the line. "Where they're closest together, that's where the water is backing up most." "How do you know?" "Because that's where the horses were most bothered." He'd watched too. He'd been watching from 30 feet away all afternoon with the attention of a man cataloging something. The roan stopped completely twice in that cluster. "He only does that when it's bad," she said. She'd noticed that too. "When it's bad." She folded the map. Around her, the work crews were packing up for the day. Tired people moving with the efficient slowness of those who've worked as hard as the body will allow and are already thinking about tomorrow. The sounds of wagon wheels and horses and voices carrying across the cooler evening air felt, for a moment, like something she wanted to stop and pay attention to, because it was the sound of a dozen people choosing to be here instead of anywhere else. And she was aware that this was not a small thing. Harlan Garfield came past with his brother Cass, heading for their horses, and he stopped briefly. "Third blockage is cleared," he said. "Cass and the Tolliver boy can tackle the fourth one in the morning. Should finish by midday." "That leaves the secondary branch," she said. He knew. She could see from his face that he'd been listening while she and Gideon worked out the afternoon's discovery. In a group this size, working this close together, information moved like water. It found all the low places. "How much will the materials cost?" he asked. She told him. He received the number with a face that didn't react to it much. "You already spent your reserve on the gravel," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd apparently been paying more attention to the financial situation than she'd known. "Yes." He pulled at the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a habit she'd noticed when he was thinking. "My father's tools are still in the barn, good stonework tools that nobody's used in years." He said it in the flat, sideways way he offered things, never quite directly. "If you could use them, there'd be no charge for the loan." "The materials, though." "Talk to Rachel Voss," he said, and walked on to his horse. She watched him go. Cass Garfield gave her a brief nod as he passed, which was a different kind of communication, but meant roughly the same thing. "We're still here. We'll be back." She stood in the field as the last of the light went orange and the air cooled and the day's work settled into the ground around her. The main channel was nearly clear. The junction was running. The field was draining. Most of it, most of the way. And there was a new problem waiting in the northeast section that would cost her the last of what she'd kept back for winter. She thought about her father, alone in this field with his notebook and his theories, and nobody coming to help him dig. She was not alone. She didn't quite know how that had happened. She folded the map into her coat pocket, turned, and walked back toward the house. In the south pasture, the horses were settling for the night, moving in their loose, comfortable groups among each other. The roan stood at the fence line facing the field, and as she passed, he turned his head to watch her go, his dark eyes catching the last of the light. 24 days, a secondary branch to clear, a connection to build, and then, if everything they'd done held, 60 acres to plant in a window that was closing whether she was ready or not. She went inside and lit the lantern and started writing a list of what she needed Rachel Voss to help her find. Rachel Voss did not make things easy. That wasn't her nature, and Maeve had come to understand that this was actually the more respectful version of Rachel, the woman who pushed back, asked hard questions, and made you justify your numbers was the same woman who took you seriously enough to bother. She listened to Maeve's list on Wednesday morning, read the cost estimates, and then put the paper down on the counter and looked at her. "You're spending your winter reserve," she said. "I know. If the harvest underperforms, I know what happens if the harvest underperforms." Maeve kept her voice even. "I've been running those numbers for 2 months. I understand the risk." "Then explain it to me. Not the numbers, the reasoning. Why is the secondary branch worth your last margin?" Maeve thought about how to say it. Not the version that sounded brave or foolish, but the true version. Because if I plan over that saturated section and it fails, I lose a third of the field's yield. I won't have enough to pay the bank, and there will be nothing to show for the drainage work except a partial repair that proves nothing. She paused. If I fix it properly, and the whole field produces, even modestly, I have a chance at paying what I owe. If I protect my winter reserve and the harvest falls short, I lose the ranch anyway. I've just also saved $15. Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter for her ledger. "Same arrangement as before," she said. "Corn at harvest rates. Bring me the material list and I'll see what I can source at reasonable cost. I need it in 4 days." "I heard you." She opened the ledger without ceremony. "Don't stand there. I have other customers." The materials arrived on Saturday on 2 wagons that Rachel had apparently arranged through a supplier in the next county, which meant she'd sent the order the same morning Maeve had asked, before Maeve had even confirmed she wanted the arrangement. Maeve noticed this and didn't comment on it. Rachel Voss planned for everything. It was both useful and slightly unsettling. The secondary branch excavation started that same afternoon. They had 19 days. Gideon put the first probe into the ground at the cluster point he'd identified from the horse survey, and within 2 feet confirmed what he'd suspected. The blockage here was a combination of silting and a partial wall fracture that had created a dam effect, backing water up into the field section above it. Clearing it required opening a longer trench than any they'd dug yet, about 60 feet to access the full extent of the damage, and building a proper connection to the main junction line, which meant digging laterally to meet the existing channel work at an angle that Gideon calculated with more precision than Maeve had expected from a man working without instruments. "You do this in your head?" she asked, watching him pace out the connection angle. "I've been doing this for 40 years, he said, not looking up. "You stop needing the paper after a while." She believed him. She'd watched him read ground conditions the way other men read text, fluently, without conscious effort, the knowledge so thoroughly absorbed it had become instinct. She thought about what that kind of expertise was worth, and thought about the fact that it had been sitting unused on a small farm 6 miles south of town because nobody had asked for it in years, and felt something sharp and uncomfortable about that. "After this is done," she said, "if people ask you about drainage work, people don't ask about drainage work. They will." She said it with a certainty she didn't entirely feel but believed anyway. When this field produces, they'll want to know how, and the answer involves you. He didn't respond to that. He went back to his pacing, but she noticed that the line of his shoulders changed slightly. Not much, just enough to be visible to someone who'd been watching him work for 2 months. "Oui." The final channel blockage, the 4th on the main line, which Cass Garfield and the younger Tolliver had cleared by midday Thursday, as Harlan had predicted, turned out to have been the last straightforward problem they'd face. Everything that came after it had complications. The secondary branch blockage, when they fully exposed it, showed a fracture pattern in the stone lining that extended further than Gideon had estimated. Not catastrophically, the structure was still fundamentally sound, but clearing it without causing the fractures to propagate required a care and slowness that cost them a day and a half they hadn't planned to spend. Cass, who had become the group's de facto stonework expert, Spent the better part of one full afternoon lying in a trench with a lamp, assessing fracture angles in a way that Maeve found both impressive and painful to watch, because the trench was not built for a man of his size, and he was doing things to his back that he was going to feel for a week. He came out of the trench covered in mud and moved his shoulders experimentally. "Fixable," he said. "We pack the fractures with lime mortar before we do the clearance. Let it set overnight, then we clear." "That's another day." "That's not losing the channel wall," he said, in the tone of a man explaining why a small delay was better than a large catastrophe. "Your call." She did the math. 17 days remaining. If they waited overnight for the mortar to set and then cleared the blockage and built the connection, they had, barely, enough time to complete the secondary branch work and still plant before the frost window closed. "Do the mortar," she said. Cass nodded. He did not ask where she was going to get lime mortar on short notice. He seemed to have understood by this point that Rachel Voss was the answer to most logistical questions. He was correct. The mortar set, they cleared the blockage. The connection to the main junction went in on a Tuesday that was the hottest day of what remained of the summer, the kind of heat that sat on everything and made movement feel like working against resistance on every side. When they opened the final seal and let the secondary branch flow into the main system, water moved through the connection with a decisiveness that the earlier, smaller flows hadn't had. The pent-up pressure of the backed-up section releasing into the cleared channel, audible at the junction as a low gurgle that Gideon crouched down to listen to with the focused attention of a doctor checking a heartbeat. He put his palm flat on the ground above the channel. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole system." 14 days to planting window close. The seed was shorter season variety, a dense-eared corn that Rachel had sourced from a supplier 2 counties east who'd used it for years on a farm with similar frost constraints. It was more expensive per bushel than standard seed and produced a smaller ear. Not ideal, but it matured in 70 days instead of 90, which was the difference between a harvest and a frozen field. Maeve planted with every available person in a 3-day push that started before sunrise each morning and ran until the light was gone. She planted with aching arms and a back that complained with increasing specificity about the work she was asking of it. She planted in the section she'd thought was lost, the center section above the secondary branch, which had drained sufficiently in the 10 days since the secondary line had opened that Gideon judged it ready, cautiously, with the qualifier that they'd need to watch it closely through the early growth weeks. She planted the roan's field. That was how she'd started thinking of it. The area he'd stopped at first, all those weeks ago. Last, on the 3rd evening, alone, after everyone else had gone home. She worked a long row in the fading light, making the holes with the planting stick at measured intervals, dropping seed, covering it, moving on. It was methodical work, the kind of work that leaves the mind free to go where it wants. She thought about Daniel. She didn't do that as often as she used to. Grief has its own seasons, she'd found, and the acute season had passed into something more like weather, present but not always dominant. She thought about what he would have made of this summer. He'd been a practical man who respected concrete results and was suspicious of theory that didn't eventually connect to something you could hold in your hand. He might have taken some convincing at the start, but he would have been in this field with her. She knew that without question. Whatever else had been complicated about their years together, he would have been here. She thought about her father, who had been here already, in a sense, who had mapped the problem, identified the principle, and left it for someone with the stubbornness to follow it through. She didn't know whether to be angry at him for not finishing it, or grateful that he'd gotten as far as he had. She'd been going back and forth on that for weeks. It probably didn't matter. What he'd done was enough. What she'd done with it was something else. She finished the last row and stood at the edge of the field in the dark, and the field was silent and still and completely ordinary looking in the way that planted fields are. No evidence at the surface of anything that had happened below it, no indication that 60 acres of what the county had written off as dead land now had a functioning drainage system running beneath it, and 10,000 seeds settling into soil that was, for the first time in over a decade, capable of sustaining root growth to full depth. She was 8 days ahead of the frost window close. Barely. It was enough. The waiting was its own kind of work. She'd known that planting was not the end of it, had known that intellectually since before she'd started, But the experience of it was different from the knowing. After 2 months of constant physical labor, of problems that required immediate response and decisions that had to be made in real time with incomplete information, the shift to watching and waiting had a quality that was almost disorienting. She checked the field every morning. She checked the drainage outflow at the creek to make sure the system was still running. She watched the soil at the center section, where the secondary branch had been the last repair, for any sign that the waterlogging was reasserting itself. She slept badly, which was not surprising but was exhausting. Gideon came by twice a week. He walked the field with her in the mornings with the methodical patience of a man who had seen things grow and not grow many times and understood that fretting didn't accelerate germination. He checked the drainage at the junction and along the main channel. He pronounced the system stable and the soil conditions appropriate, and then drank the coffee she made him and sat on the porch for a while without saying much. On his third visit, 2 weeks after planting, he stopped in the center section and crouched down. She crouched beside him. The first shoots were coming through the soil, thin, pale, tentative, but unmistakably there, not just in the edge sections where she'd half expected them. In the center, in the roans field, in the section that had been saturated 10 days before planting, and that she'd been watching with the particular anxiety of a person who has staked everything on a repair they can't fully verify until it either works or doesn't. Uniform emergence, Gideon said. He wasn't smiling because Gideon didn't smile much, but there was something in his voice that she recognized as the closest he got to it. Across the whole section, that's what you want to see. She looked at the shoots. They were not impressive objects individually, thin green threads barely an inch out of the ground. But there were rows of them, dozens to a row, marching across the center section in lines that were not perfectly straight because she had not planted them with perfect straightness, but were straight enough, were real, were growing. "Is it going to be enough?" she asked. "For the payment?" Gideon sat back on his heels. He was quiet for a moment. "If the emergence rate holds across the field, and if we don't get an early frost, and if the drainage continues performing," he turned his head to look at the full sweep of the east field, all 60 acres of it beginning its slow, collective uprising from the soil. "Yes," he said, "I think it's going to be enough." She nodded once. She didn't say anything. He looked at her sideways. "You're not going to say anything?" "I'm thinking." "What are you thinking?" "That I should have asked you for help in June instead of July," she said. "We would have had more time." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. "You came when you were ready. Most people never come at all." The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that waiting for something important is never quite easy. She irrigated when the late summer heat spiked, drawing from the creek in a way that the functioning drainage system made possible. Water in from the top, water out from the bottom, the field managing moisture the way it was designed to manage it. She watched the corn grow with the daily attention of someone who has put everything they have into a single outcome and cannot look away. The Garfield brothers came by periodically, not to work now, but to look. Dell came. The Tollivers came. Clara Briggs came. Rachel Voss did not come, but she asked Maeve detailed questions about growth progress every time Maeve came into the store, which was Rachel's equivalent of coming to look. The county, she realized, had gotten invested without entirely meaning to. The same people who had laughed in June were checking the Eastfield's progress in September, the way you check on something you'd dismissed, and then found yourself wrong about. With a mixture of genuine curiosity and a private reckoning they were mostly keeping to themselves. Harlan Garfield, riding past on a Thursday morning in mid-September, stopped at the fence line and looked at the field for a long time. The corn was knee-high now, darker green than she'd expected, standing in its rows with a density that made the field look, for the first time, like a field that was supposed to have corn in it. Maeve was checking the drainage outflow at the creek when she saw him stop. She walked up. He looked at the field for another moment before acknowledging her. "I told my father this land was finished," he said. "He thought the same thing." He paused. "He thought your father was not stupid, but chasing something that wasn't there." "He wasn't wrong to think that," she said, "based on what anyone could see." "Based on what anyone could see?" He nodded slowly. He was looking at the corn. "How much do you figure you'll get?" Gideon estimates between 40 and 50 bushels per acre on the recovered sections. Lower on the center section, maybe 35. Depends on the rest of the season. Harlan did the math. She could see him doing it, the slight adjustment of his expression as the numbers came together. That's a strong harvest, he said. Better than most of the county this year. He finally looked at her. The drought's been bad for everyone else. We're all going to be short. She knew this. She'd been watching the other farms' situations with a careful eye, not from satisfaction, because other people's failed harvests meant real hardship, and she wasn't interested in feeling good about that, but because it was relevant context for what her own harvest would mean. If you have surplus to sell, Harlan said, in the careful way he said things he'd been thinking about for a while, there'll be buyers at fair price, more buyers than usual. He paused. I might be one of them. She looked at him. My south field came up short, he said, flat and simple. I'd rather buy from you than go to the mill at county road prices. It was, she understood, the most direct thing Harlan Garfield had said to her in the entire summer. No sideways approach, no offer framed as something else. Just, I need corn, and you have corn, and we both know what happened to get you to that position. I'll let you know what the yield looks like at harvest, she said. If there's surplus after the bank payment, we can talk price. He nodded. He turned his horse and rode on. He did not say anything else, but she thought that was all right. Some things didn't need more words. The harvest started on the 4th of October. She'd recruited help the same way she'd recruited help for the digging. Directly, without apology, from the people who had shown up over the summer and proven that they meant what their presence implied. The Garfields came. Del Purvis came with his wagon, the Tollivers and their older son, Clara Briggs and her husband, who turned out to be a fast and efficient corn hand. Gideon came, though Maeve watched him carefully throughout the day and twice steered him toward less physically demanding tasks without making it obvious she was doing so. He noticed, she was fairly sure, and accepted it without comment, which was the correct way to handle that kind of thing. They worked for 3 days. The yield came in at 43 bushels per acre on average across the recovered sections. The center section, the one she'd almost given up on, the one she'd spent her winter reserve to repair, came in at 38. Not the highest number, but real. Real corn from ground that had produced nothing for 11 years. On the evening of the 3rd day, when the last of the crop was in the barn and the workers had gone home, she sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and the numbers and worked through it one more time. Total yield. Price per bushel at current market, minus what she owed Rachel, minus operating costs for the summer. What remained? She wrote the final number on the paper. She looked at it. She wrote it again because she'd been doing calculations under pressure for months and had learned to verify anything that looked like the answer she was hoping for. The number was the same. It was enough to pay Aldous Fenn and the Harlan Valley Lending Association everything she owed, the outstanding debt, the current payment, and the administrative fee, and have a thin margin remaining. Not comfortable, not what she'd call security, but enough. The complete amount, every cent. She put the pencil down. Outside, the east field lay in the early October dark, harvested and quiet, its rows stripped bare and its soil looser and darker than it had been in September, the drainage system running beneath it in its patient, invisible way, moving water the direction water was supposed to move. She should have felt something enormous. She'd expected something enormous, some arriving wave of relief or triumph that would make all the preceding months make sense in a single, clear feeling. Instead, what she felt was quieter than that and more specific. She felt like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just, carefully and without ceremony, set it down. She'd set it down. That was all. That was everything. She closed the notebook she'd been calculating in, her own notebook, not her father's, though his sat on the corner of the desk where she'd kept it all summer, and went to bed before 9 o'clock for the first time since June, and slept without dreaming until morning. She was at the bank when it opened. Aldous Fenn was a man in his late 50s, precise in his appearance and his speech, who had been managing the Harlan Valley Lending Association for long enough that he'd developed the particular quality of self-assurance that comes from being right about financial outcomes most of the time. He had been right, in his estimation, about the Holloway property. He had been prepared, quietly, professionally, for the foreclosure process he'd expected to initiate this month. He was not clearly prepared for Maeve Holloway to walk into his bank at 8 in the morning with a leather satchel and set it on his desk and open it. She counted the money out in front of him. She did not rush it. She counted it in the methodical way she'd learned from watching her father settle debts, the way that communicated, without requiring any words, that she knew exactly what she was doing and had verified the amount and was entirely in command of this particular transaction. When she was done, she slid the money across the desk. Principal balance, current payment, and administrative fee, she said. In full. Fenn looked at the money, then at her, then at the money again. Mrs. Holloway, he said, and then appeared to run short of what he'd intended to follow that with. I'll need a receipt, she said, and the updated mortgage status in writing, showing the outstanding balance cleared. He recovered himself. He was a professional man, and professional habits are reliable, and produced the receipt book from his desk drawer. While he wrote, he said, without looking up, The field produced this year. The field produced this year. More than anyone expected. More than most people expected, she said. Not everyone. He looked up at that briefly, but she wasn't being provocative about it. She was being accurate. Gideon had believed it was possible. Rachel had bet on it. Del Purvis had shown up with his horse and his shovel. The Garfield brothers had come. A dozen people had looked at what she was doing and decided quietly, without fanfare, that it was worth showing up for. She took the receipt and the updated mortgage document and put them in the satchel and stood up. Fenn stood as well, a reflex of professional courtesy that he might not have entirely intended. He said, The land. Your father always believed it was sound. He was right, she said. She walked out of the bank into the October morning, the satchel in her hand and the receipt folded inside it, and the clear, cold air hitting her face. The street was beginning to fill with the morning's traffic. Wagons, horses, people moving between the town's businesses with the purposeful routine of an ordinary day. None of them had seen what she'd seen. None of them had stood in the east field at the bottom of a 6-foot trench looking at a stone-lined channel built by hands they'd never know, water moving through it after a decade of standing still. None of them had watched a roan horse stop in the middle of a brown, baked field and hold perfectly still, because something in the ground beneath him was speaking a language he'd been listening to his whole life. But they'd all eat this winter. Some of them, Harlan Garfield among them, would eat partly because of what she'd grown in a field they'd called dead. She walked to where her horse was tied, put the satchel in the saddlebag, and mounted. She had to get back. There was still the south field to prepare for next year, and a conversation with Rachel about spring planting volumes, and a letter she'd been putting off writing to a drainage engineer in the next county who'd apparently heard about the Holloway system from someone and wanted to know more about it. There was always more to do. That was the nature of the thing. She turned the horse toward home. The letter from the drainage engineer arrived on a Thursday in late October, 3 weeks after she'd walked out of Aldous Fenn's bank with the receipt folded in her satchel. His name was Warren Colby, and he wrote in the precise, slightly formal style of a man who had spent his career producing technical documents and had never entirely shifted out of that register when writing personal correspondence. He had heard about the Holloway drainage restoration from a contact in the county. He didn't say who, but Maeve suspected Gideon, who had more professional connections than he ever talked about, and he was writing to ask whether she would be willing to describe the system in detail for a survey he was compiling on historical agricultural drainage infrastructure in the Wyoming Territory. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then set it beside her father's notebook, where it sat for 2 days while she thought about what to do with it. She wasn't sure what she had to offer a drainage engineer. The technical knowledge in the notebook was her father's and Gideon's. The horse survey method was something she'd read about in a margin note and tried because she had nothing better. The actual stonework had been done by Cass Garfield and Gideon and a dozen men who'd shown up with their own hands and tools. What she'd contributed was harder to categorize. The decision to start, the decision to keep going, the decision to spend the last of the reserve on the secondary branch, when the comfortable thing would have been to protect what little safety net she had left. She wasn't sure any of that was what Warren Colby was looking for. On Saturday, she wrote him back anyway. She told him about the notebook, about the Hartley survey Rachel had found, about the horse method and how they'd used it to map the channel locations before excavating. She described the junction structure and what Gideon had done to restore it. She was careful to name everyone who had contributed anything significant because the letter was going into some kind of record and she wanted the record to be accurate. She sent it with the morning post and went back to work. The South Field preparation was slower going than she'd hoped. The soil there was in better basic condition than the East Field had been. It had never stopped producing entirely, but 2 seasons of thin yields had left it depleted in ways that needed addressing before spring planting, and Maeve had been doing enough reading in her father's agricultural books that she now had opinions about soil amendment that she hadn't had 4 months ago. Gideon came on a Tuesday and walked the South Field with her, and she told him what she was thinking, and he listened with the patient attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. Composting the harvest residue back in would help, he said. Nitrogen needs time to break down, so you'd want to do it now, not in spring. I was thinking the same thing. He looked at her sideways. You've been reading. I've been reading for months. I just didn't know what I was reading about until recently. She paused. My father had a lot of books. Thomas always read more than he farmed, Gideon said, with a small affection in his voice that she didn't often hear from him. He'd have been better served the other way around most years. But this year, he looked at the East Field in the distance, stripped and quiet and visibly different in its soil color from the surrounding fields. This year, it turned out differently. He would have liked this, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Gideon nodded once. He didn't add anything to it, which was the right call. There wasn't anything to add. November came in cold and the East Field froze over in the second week, which was normal and expected and also oddly reassuring. Frozen ground meant the soil had enough moisture content to freeze properly, which meant the drainage system was functioning in the way it was supposed to function, neither too wet nor too dry. Gideon had told her to watch for this. She watched for it and noted it in the new notebook she'd started keeping, which was filling up faster than she'd expected. She was writing down everything, she realized. Not just field observations, but conversations, decisions, the reasoning behind things she'd tried. She'd started doing it without a clear purpose, and it had gradually become something more deliberate. A record of the summer in a form that could be used by someone who hadn't lived through it. On a Wednesday in November, Del Purvis came by for what had become a semi-regular visit. He'd taken to stopping in once a week or so on some pretext or other, always with something practical to discuss, always staying slightly longer than the practical matter required. His farm was 3 miles east, and he was, she'd come to understand, lonely in the way that widowers often became lonely without entirely recognizing it in themselves. He sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and looked at the new notebook and the maps and the copy she'd made of the old Hartley survey and said, "You're turning into your father. I'm taking that as a compliment." It is one. He turned the nearest page toward him and looked at the drainage sketches she'd been updating. Cass Garfield came by my place on Monday. What did he want? He's been thinking about his West Field, the one that's been producing short for 3 years. Del put the page back. He thinks it might be a drainage issue. She looked at him. He didn't want to ask you directly, Del said, with the mild diplomatic neutrality of a man relaying information he finds slightly amusing. He was hoping I'd mention it and you'd offer. Harlan's brother is too proud to ask me for help? You and Harlan had a complicated summer. Cass is being careful. She thought about that. Cass Garfield had spent the better part of 3 days lying in a trench doing precise stonework on her behalf, and he was being careful about asking for help with his own field. It said something about the social geometry of small places, the careful accounting of who owed what to whom, and the elaborate indirection people used to navigate it. Tell him to come by Saturday, she said. We'll look at his field. Del nodded. He finished his coffee. He looked like he was going to say something else and then didn't, which was a familiar pattern with Del. He held things back until he had decided they needed saying, which sometimes took weeks. Something else? She asked. He put the cup down. The Fenton place, he said. The old homestead on the North Road that's been sitting empty for 2 years. I heard Elias Croft is putting in an offer to the estate. Elias Croft. The name sat in the room for a moment with the particular weight it had always carried for her. That's his business to do, she said. The land sits above the same water table as yours, same formation, Gideon thinks. Del looked at her evenly. If Croft gets it and doesn't know what to do with the drainage, it'll affect upstream conditions for you within a few years. She hadn't thought about that. She turned it over in her mind, the downstream consequences of what happened on adjacent land, the way that what one farm did to its water management affected what the farm next to it had to deal with. It was one of the things her father's notebook kept returning to in its marginal notes, she realized. The land as connected system. What you did to one part, you eventually did to all the parts. What's the estate asking? She said. More than Croft is offering, I heard. They haven't settled on a price. She didn't have money for land. That was the plain fact. She had a cleared mortgage, a winter reserve that was thinner than she'd like, and the promise of a stronger harvest next year. But she didn't have the kind of capital that purchasing even a struggling homestead required. She also didn't have the kind of problems that would come from Elias Croft controlling the water table upstream of her east field. I need to talk to Rachel, she said. Dell stood up. He did not say I told you so, or I thought you'd see it that way, or any of the things a person might say when they've successfully communicated something they wanted to communicate. He just put on his hat and said he'd see her Saturday and walked out, which was entirely characteristic. Rachel Voss, when presented with the Fenton Place situation, did what Rachel always did. She went quiet for longer than was comfortable while she turned it over in her mind, and then she asked 6 precise questions, and then she went quiet again. You can't buy it outright, she said. No. But you could manage it. Maeve looked at her. I don't follow. The estate wants the land sold, not managed. But the reason it's been sitting empty is that they can't find a buyer at their price. Rachel leaned on the counter. If you approach them as a working partner, someone to manage the land and share the yield until a fair purchase price was established over time, they get income instead of nothing. Croft doesn't get upstream control. And you expand your operation without needing capital you don't have. Maeve thought about this. It was more complicated than buying or not buying. It had more moving parts and more ways to go wrong. That requires the estate to trust my management, she said. The East Field is evidence of your management. 43 bushels per acre on land that hasn't produced in 11 years. Rachel's voice was flat, factual. That's what you bring to that conversation. It was strange, Maeve thought, how much had changed about what she brought to any conversation. In June, she'd walked into Rachel's store as a woman most of the county considered a failed widow chasing an impossible idea. She was still a widow. She was still running a ranch on thin margins with no certainty about the future. None of that had changed in any material way. But the field had changed, and with it, apparently, how she stood in relation to the county, not because of some transformation in who she was, but simply because she'd done a thing that other people could now see. She still wasn't sure how she felt about that. It seemed precarious, a reputation built on a single good harvest, dependent on conditions she couldn't entirely control. One bad year and the whole picture could shift again. She said as much to Rachel. Rachel looked at her with the flat patience she applied to things she considered unnecessary worry. One bad year and everyone in the county is struggling. That's not specific to you. She paused. What's specific to you is that you now have a functioning drainage system under 60 acres of land that the drought barely touched, in a county where the drought is affecting everyone else. That's not luck. That's infrastructure. Infrastructure. She turned the word over. It wasn't how she'd been thinking about what she'd built. She'd been thinking about it as the East Field, as the drainage, as the things she'd done to save the ranch. But Rachel was right that it was something more structural than that. It was a physical fact about the land that would persist through bad years and good years and everything in between. I'll write to the estate, she said. Well, she wrote to the estate on a Friday evening, carefully and specifically laying out the management proposal the way she'd seen her father lay out complex proposals in his letters, stating the terms first, then the evidence supporting the terms, then the practical logistics. She used the East Field numbers. She named Gideon's credentials. She described the drainage system and what it had produced, and what similar methods could potentially do for the Fenton property's neglected fields. She sent it the following Monday and tried not to think about it too much, which was not entirely successful. In the meantime, Cass Garfield came on Saturday, as Dell had relayed, and she walked his Westfield with him in the cold November air while he explained what he'd been seeing for 3 years. Reduced emergence rates, plants that grew to about 2/3 of normal height and then stalled, ears that were undersized relative to what the same field had once produced. She asked him questions. She looked at the soil the way Gideon had taught her to look at it, the crust texture, the color variation, the way the surface held or didn't hold moisture. She pressed her palm to the ground in 3 different places. "I can't tell you for certain without running a survey," she said. "But it looks like what the East Field looked like before we started. The soil behavior is similar." Cass was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who absorbed information before responding to it, which she appreciated. "You think the horses would tell us something here too?" "I think it's worth trying, the roan especially." She looked at the field. "He's been right every time." Cass nodded slowly. He looked at the field with the expression of a man who has been struggling with something for 3 years and is just beginning to let himself believe there might be a different explanation than the one he'd settled for. "I told Harlan last spring the field was just worn out, needed to lie fallow." He paused. "He agreed with me. You were both working with the information you had. We were both wrong." "Maybe," she said. "We'll know more after the survey." He looked at her. "Why are you willing to do this? We weren't—" He stopped, started again. "We weren't good to you at the start of the summer." She thought about how to answer that honestly without it becoming either a grievance or a false absolution. "You came," she said. "When it mattered, you came and you did the work. That's what I remember." She paused. "And your field affects my field. The whole water table around here is connected. If your drainage is failing, it's not just your problem." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father used to say something like that. About the land." "I know, I've been reading his notebooks." They walked back toward the fence line in the cold, their breath coming in small clouds, the November ground hard and gray around them. The Garfield Westfield looked, from a distance, like any other dormant winter field, indistinguishable from the ones around it, giving no outward indication of what might be wrong beneath it. That was the thing about this kind of problem. It didn't announce itself. It just quietly starved everything above it until someone patient enough to look down instead of up figured out what was happening. Gideon came for coffee on a Tuesday in late November, and she showed him the letter she'd drafted for the Fenton estate and the notes she'd been keeping on the Garfield West Field and the correspondence with Warren Colby, which had continued with a second letter asking more specific questions about the horse survey method. He read through everything at the kitchen table with the same careful attention he gave to drainage sketches, occasionally going back to reread a section. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at his coffee for a moment. "You're building something," he said. "I'm trying to keep the ranch running." "That too. But you're also building something else." He looked at her. "You know that, don't you?" She'd been aware of it in a peripheral way, the way you're aware of something that's happening slightly outside your direct line of sight, visible only when you're not looking at it directly. The letters, the notebooks, the conversations with Cass and Dell and Rachel, the inquiry from Warren Colby. They were accumulating into something that had a shape she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely see yet. "I don't know what I'm building," she said. "I just know what needs doing." "That's how most things that matter get built," he said. He picked up his coffee. "Your father would have gotten here too. He just ran out of time." She thought about that, about the version of this summer that would have happened if her father had lived another few years, if he'd had the time to follow the notebook to its conclusion, to run the horse survey, to find Gideon and make the argument that the East Field was worth fighting for. He'd have done it. She was certain of that. He'd have done it with less money and more stubbornness and probably fewer helpers, because he'd been worse than her at asking for things, but he'd have found his way there. Or maybe not. Maybe there was something in the particular combination of that summer, her need, the timing, the people who showed up, the cold fact of 90 days that compressed everything into a shape that could be acted on, that wouldn't have arranged itself the same way under different circumstances. Maybe the East Field needed exactly this summer to be restored, with exactly these people in exactly these conditions. She didn't know. She wasn't sure it mattered. What had happened, and here she was on the other side of it. "I need to tell you something," she said. Gideon looked at her. "The Colby correspondence. He's asking if I know anyone who could consult on drainage restoration for farms in the territory. Someone with practical experience who understands both the engineering and the field work." She paused. I told him I knew exactly one person who fit that description and that I'd ask whether he was interested. Gideon was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had been doing physical work for 50 years, scarred and rough and entirely honest about their history. "I'm 71 years old," he said. "You walked a quarter-mile of channel inspection last week without stopping. That's not the same as taking on consulting work." "He's not asking you to dig trenches. He's asking for your knowledge." She held his gaze. "You have knowledge that no one else in this county has. Maybe in this territory. And right now it's sitting on your farm, getting used twice a week to check my drainage outflow." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "What exactly did you tell him about me?" "I told him you restored a collapsed drainage junction that had been underground for 30 years, and you did it without instruments, working from your own memory of how the system should function." She paused. "I told him you were the reason the East Field produced this year." He looked away from her, out the window at the East Field, which was frozen and dormant and would stay that way until spring. She watched his face do the complicated work of a man who has spent years believing his best days were behind him, confronting the possibility that this might not be entirely true. "I'd have to think about it," he said. "I know, take your time. It might not come to anything. It might not." She picked up her own coffee. "But it might." The estate responded to her letter in the second week of December. The terms they proposed were not exactly what she'd outlined. They wanted a shorter arrangement than she'd suggested and a higher percentage of the annual yield. But the core of it was there: management of the Fenton property, profit sharing, a path toward eventual purchase if the arrangement proved successful. She brought the counter-proposal to Rachel, who read it and made 4 specific objections, and they spent an hour at the store counter working through what was negotiable and what wasn't, in the way that Maeve had come to rely on. Rachel's unsentimental precision calibrating against her own instinct for what was and wasn't fair. They settled on terms. She sent the counter-proposal. The estate accepted it in late December, which meant that when January came and she was looking at the year ahead, she was looking at it as the manager of not 60, but nearly 120 acres, half of which needed exactly the kind of drainage assessment and possible restoration she'd spent the summer learning to do. She sat with that number for a while, feeling its weight, its possibility, its considerable attendant risk. She was not, she reminded herself, a different person than she'd been in June when she'd walked out of Callum's Feed and Supply while 8 men laughed. She was the same woman with the same capacity for doubt and the same susceptibility to the low 3 in the morning hours when everything seemed precarious. She still had bad weeks. She still made mistakes in judgment and had to correct them. She was still figuring out most of this as she went, but she had the notebooks now, her father's and her own. She had Gideon, who had written a careful letter to Warren Colby accepting the consulting inquiry, and had then appeared slightly embarrassed about this when she'd congratulated him, in the way he was about most things that mattered to him. She had Rachel and Dell and the Garfields and the Tollivers and Clara Briggs, and a dozen other people who had, over the course of a summer, become something she didn't have a clean word for. Not employees, not quite friends, something more reciprocal and less categorized than either. People who'd shown up, people who knew what the East Field had taken and what it had given back. And she had the East Field itself, under its winter cover, the drainage system running beneath it in the cold darkness, moving water the direction water was supposed to move, doing the quiet and invisible work that would make everything visible above it possible in the spring. On a Sunday in January, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the air feel solid and every sound carried farther than it should, she went out to the East Field alone. She didn't go for any practical reason. She went because she wanted to. That was still a relatively new thing for her. Doing something simply because she wanted to, without requiring the wanting to justify itself against some practical purpose. She was working on it. She walked the field's edge in the cold, her breath white, the frozen ground hard and certain under her boots. The field looked like nothing much, dormant, flat, the harvested rows barely visible under the frost. If you didn't know what was under it, you'd see just another empty winter field in a county full of them. But she knew what was under it. Stone and water and 40 years of forgotten knowledge and the instincts of 20 horses and the back work of a dozen people and her father's margin notes and a summer of decisions made with incomplete information and inadequate resources and the persistent, unreasonable refusal to accept that the ground was dead when everything she could see and feel and read told her it was only waiting. She stopped at the center of the field, above the secondary branch, above the junction of all the restored channels, and stood still in the cold for a while. There was a thing she'd been trying to understand since the summer, and she'd gotten closer to it in the months since, but still hadn't quite arrived at the full shape of it. It had to do with what the field had taught her, but also what the field had confirmed about something she'd already half known without being able to say it clearly. She'd spent a long time believing that the situation she was in, the debt, the dead field, the mocking, the isolation, was fundamentally about a lack of something. Money, mostly. Resources, support, the things she didn't have that other people had, and that would have made everything easier if she'd had them too. But the Eastfield's problem hadn't been a lack, it had been a misdirection. The water wasn't absent from the field. It was there. It was always there. It was drowning the roots from below. The field didn't need more water. It needed the water it had to find a way to move. The system needed to be cleared, not filled. She thought about that all the time now. About how much of what looks like absence is actually blockage. How often what we call emptiness or failure or dead ground is just something that hasn't found its direction yet. Her father's knowledge hadn't been lost. It had been sitting in a notebook in a desk drawer, backed up behind the obstacle of not knowing where to look. Gideon's expertise hadn't been gone. It had been sitting on a small farm 6 miles south, backed up behind the obstacle of nobody asking for it. The East Field hadn't been dead. It had been drowning, backed up behind 60 years of collapsed stonework, waiting for someone to clear the blockage and let it breathe. She didn't know if this was wisdom or just the particular story she was telling herself to make the summer make sense. Probably some of both. That was how most understanding worked. Part real insight, part narrative you build to survive the thing you've been through. But it felt true to her. It felt like something she'd actually learned, not just something that had happened to her. The land wasn't generous and it wasn't cruel. It was indifferent in the way that all physical things are indifferent. It responded to conditions, not intentions. Give it the right conditions, and it would produce. Fail to give it those conditions, and it would fail, regardless of how much you wanted it to succeed. The wanting was necessary. You had to want it enough to do the work, but it wasn't sufficient. You had to find out what was actually wrong before you could fix it, and finding out what was actually wrong required the willingness to look below the surface, past the obvious explanation, past the comfortable consensus of everyone around you who'd already decided they knew what the problem was. Most of the county had decided they knew what the problem with the Eastfield was. It was dead ground, cursed ground, the wishful thinking of a family that had never been entirely realistic. They'd looked at the surface, brown and flat and unproductive, and they'd constructed a perfectly logical explanation for what they saw. They weren't stupid. They weren't even wrong, exactly, based on what they could see. They just weren't looking below the surface, and nobody had asked them to. She'd asked. She'd looked. And underneath everything they'd written off, she'd found a system that still worked, once you cleared what was blocking it. She pulled off one glove and pressed her palm to the frozen ground. Cold. Hard. Silent. But underneath it, she knew. Water moving through stone channels, dark and purposeful, carrying what the land couldn't use to a place where it could drain away and stop doing damage. The system, running in the dark, doing its work the way it always had when given the chance to do it. She stood up and put her glove back on. She thought about writing one final entry in her father's notebook. Not to complete anything, because the notebook wasn't hers to complete, but to add to it. To put her name beside his in the margins of the thing he'd started, because that seemed like the accurate record of what had happened. Not that she'd finished what he'd started, but that she'd picked it up and carried it a certain distance further. And at some point, someone else would pick it up after her and carry it further still. She'd write something simple, something true. Not a conclusion, because she was 35 years old in January of 1880, with 120 acres to manage and a consulting arrangement to build and a spring planting to plan, and conclusions were for things that were finished. Something more like a note to whoever came next. The water found its way. The land remembered. We simply learned how to listen. She turned back toward the house. The cold was working its way through her coat now, the kind of deep January cold that doesn't negotiate, and there was a fire to build and coffee to make, and the new notebook to open to the next blank page. The roan watched her cross the field from his place at the south fence, his dark eyes tracking her movement the way he always tracked things. Completely, without judgment, with the patient attentiveness of a creature that had spent its whole life reading the ground and had learned not to hurry its conclusions. She lifted a hand to him as she passed. He dropped his head once, then went back to whatever he'd been reading in the frozen earth. Holloway Ranch woke into the new year, the way living things wake. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, cell by cell and acre by acre. The cold doing its quiet, necessary work of preserving what the spring would be asked to restore. There was always more to do. She went inside and got started,